What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the channel. In today's video, I just want to talk about some tips that I have that I utilize and you guys can utilize in order to avoid morale issues from re-signing players, whether it be to a cheap contract, to a long-term contract, or anything of that nature. It was actually a question that I've gotten a couple of times in the comment sections now is, okay, well, if you re-sign players to multi-year deals or you try to re-sign them to cheap deals, how do you avoid those players having issues with your team, having morale issues and playing poorly? Because as we know, morale affects a player's play. How do we avoid those things? So let's go ahead and jump into this today. Now, the first thing that I want to jump into is talking about how long I actually sign players to contracts in MLB The Show. Because I have been, relatively experienced with franchise modes, and I also do a lot of simulating and things like that, so I tend to breeze through multiple years relatively quickly. In order to prevent players from becoming unhappy, as I try to be realistically reasonable in terms of how long I actually re-sign them to contracts for. So, if we take a look at a lot of the contracts on the screen here that I've re-signed players to, while some of them might be cheap, a lot of the time what I do is I'll kind of max out at like a 5-year deal. A lot of times I'll sign players to 2, 3, 4-year deals, but a lot of the times, like I said, we're maxing out at about 5 years. All right, so then what is the significance of signing players to about 3, 4, or 5-year deals? Well, from my perspective and from a morale perspective, generally speaking, you're going to have a significantly different player most of the time. If you're at least signing a player to a 3 to 5-year deal, you know that this is a player that you want to have around long term. Well, more often than not, like I have here with players like Mauricio Dubon, Randy Arozarena, Joey Bart, all high potential players, high Bs and A's. These are players that I know within a 3 to 5 year time span are going to be significantly different players come the end of that first contract. So, whenever we go to, 3 years out with a guy like Mauricio Dubon, or we go to 5 years out with a guy like Joey Bart, who has a potential, they're going to be a significantly higher overall. Now, generally, they're also probably going to be playing significantly better than where they are right now. And so signing a player beyond that is generally going to be detrimental to your job as an organization and what you're trying to do, and detrimental to that player's morale. One thing I will say, I'll throw in a caveat, is if you try to sign a player past that point, they're generally speaking going to ask for more money, more closely related to what they'll be making at that point in time. But in order to avoid even experiencing those morale issues, I generally try to stick to somewhere in that range of 3 to 5 years for guys like that, even guys that I'll only sign to a 2-year deal or something of that nature. That way, it at least gives the opportunity to renegotiate a contract at that point and give that player a value that is more fair to what they should be worth at that point in time. Now, there have been times in the past, like I said, where I've tried to sign guys to 10-year deals and things that are absolutely crazy like that. And that is a strategy you can use within MLB The Show, especially if you know that that player is going to be like a franchise-defining player. You can try to extend them for that long, and that's something you can do. However, you have to realize that you're probably going to get negative morale penalties for that. There are a couple of things here that you can do to offset that. Actually, one major thing that you can do to offset that, and let's go ahead and show you guys what that is. So the strategy that I like to use in terms of making sure that their morale stays to where it needs to be is I like to give players a role that is conducive to what I feel like they are going to be playing at eventually. And so you have to see, whenever we go through the roles here, it changes their morale in terms of what their outlook is for playing with the team. So if it's a player that I am considering extending for 3 to 5 years, or even longer than that, what I need to do is I need to give them the playing time, and I need to essentially increase their role to a point that they're going to be extremely happy with that, and offset the fact that maybe they're making a little bit less money than they would want. or, maybe I have them signed to a little bit of a longer contract, and there's not that flexibility there. And so what you can do is you can increase their role. So while you might sign a guy originally to a platoon role, consider increasing that to an everyday role as long as you can actually give them that amount of playing time. Likewise, maybe increase it to a star role. Something that I did, for example, whenever I was negotiating my contract with Mauricio Dubon, is Mauricio Dubon only wanted he wanted a couple-year deal, but he wanted a everyday role. Instead, I gave him the star role because I don't have anybody that's going to be taking his position, and he's one of my better performing players at this point in time. So I can give him that star role and give him that increased morale boost that is going to help him, even if potentially he feels like he's making less money than he's worth. That can help offset that issue. Likewise, the next thing that is, a little bit less major, but I would say something that you can absolutely do to increase player morale, especially when they get later on into their years, is you can give them an option in order to essentially increase their morale and help offset those penalties that you might get for that player being signed to too long of a deal or too low of money or whatever it might be, or their role's not quite right. If you give them a player option, yes, they have the opportunity to opt out of their contract and potentially go to free agency, but it's not like the player's automatically gone. You'll still get the opportunity to sign that player in free agency or sign them back at a fair value, but what's going to happen is, more often than not, my players don't exercise their options, I've found, personally speaking, and, having that option in there, as you guys can see here, changes their amount of interest in the player option, and for whatever reason they get unhappy, they can opt out of that contract themselves, and then you can work out the situation moving forward from there. Now, like I said, signing a player to a super long-term deal and lowballing the amount of money and then having them become a superstar and outperforming that contract, you're never really going to solve that issue of them being paid too little, but there are certainly some things here you can do to help compensate that. Now, the other thing that you guys can do is, like I said with my contracts, whenever I try to sign these guys, I sign to 3 to 5 years or something along those lines. What happens with that is that gets you to a point where you can then comfortably make a decision to part ways with that player. So let's say, for example, Mauricio Dubon gets to this final year of his contract, or maybe this year of his contract, and he's unhappy because of the role that he has with the team, or because he's not making enough money, or whatever the situation might be. His morale isn't working out quite the way we want it to because of the contract situation. I have a good opportunity here to move on from that player because they're not locked up for 10 more years. I'm not going to feel bad about moving on from that player. I can get a fair value back for them and replace them with equal compensation. Whereas if you sign a player to a 10-year deal and they're unhappy, you're going to feel probably a little bit weird about trading that player away that has 5 years left on their contract or 7 years left on their contract or something like that. So, keeping your contracts to a reasonable length is going to help you out, especially whenever it comes time to make a decision on that player, whether the decision be to keep that player around, give them another contract, trade them away, let them walk to free agency utilizing their player option or anything like that. These are all valuable things that you can do whenever you're negotiating contracts with these players in order to keep their morale manageable. Then one more point in terms of the number of years that you give a player on their contract. Generally speaking, I'll try to sign a player if they're like a Mauricio Dubon, like they're 28 years old, or they're, in the second half of their 20s, I'll try to sign them through about the age of 30, 29, 30, 31, because that's kind of the peak of a player's career in terms of MLB The Show. And so that's a good decision point in where their future is going to lie. That's a good time to make a decision on, should I sign this player to another contract? Should I move on from them? What decision you need to make? That's a good point in time to do it, and so that's another good reference to use whenever you are negotiating contracts with these guys. And the final point that I want to give you guys here today is with a player's role, and essentially how I utilize a player's role and set a player's role. So a lot of times with a team like the Giants or a team like the Pirates or a team that's rebuilding specifically, as good examples, I like to give players the role that is realistic to them because it'll benefit their morale. So while my team might not have any 90 overall players or anything like that, that doesn't mean that I can't give a player the star role. That doesn't mean I can't give players that role in order for me to get better interest out of them and maybe sign them to a cheaper contract, or, you know, get them to have their morale continue to stay high. That type of thing is going to be beneficial to your organization, but I try to give them realistic roles in terms of what's going on with them. So while, you know, I could look at a guy and say, yeah, you're an everyday player, you also have to look at your roster and say, okay, well, who's the star? Who's a player that is actually going to deserve a better role? And so this is a pretty low overall roster. A lot of the guys, whenever they request contract re-signings, are going to request a platoon role because they're a lower overall, or they're going to request an everyday role where they could earn a star role. And so, you know, you have to be realistic in terms of what type of role you're giving them. It's, you know, for example, when I negotiate a contract with Logan Webb, he was asking for just a simple rotation role. And instead, what I did was I gave him the ace role, and that's to keep him happy. And that's for a couple of reasons. Number one, I can realistically make it happen. Nobody's going to take over that role for him for a while. And number two, he's already in that role. He's already the best pitcher on the team, so I might as well give him that ace role and leave him as the number one pitcher in the pitching rotation. With all that being said, hopefully you guys find some of this information useful. Hopefully this helps you guys out in your contract negotiations. Hopefully this helps you guys out to keep your players happy and keep them around for as long as you want to keep them around for. But like I said, you know, this is just some things that I do, some things that I've learned along the way to try to adapt and make sure that my players are happy and make sure I keep them around for the right amount of time. And, you know, I think that it is some tips and stuff that will be able to help you guys out in the long term. So if this did help you or give you some ideas, make sure you leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and comment down below with anything you'd like to see next. I'll see you guys in the next video, and I hope you guys have a good one.